Leading up to the release of Tenet, I'm reviewing each of Christopher Nolan's films in release order. This is week number 5, so we're talking about The Prestige. The Prestige tells the story of two magicians in the late 19th century whose competition with one another eventually turns toxic and deadly. Since this isn't one of Christopher Nolan's blockbusters that everyone has seen, this is going to be a spoiler-free review, but I'm going to dive into a few things. I would encourage you to go into this movie fresh without having watched this review. So if you haven't seen the film yet, ideally watch the film, then watch this review, but I'm not going to give away the twists, the turns, the big reveals of the film. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. If you've seen the film, what did you think about it? I know based off my past Christopher Nolan ranking, most people seem to like this movie a lot more than I did, at least in the past. A lot of people have it like top tier Christopher Nolan film, absolutely love it and consider it brilliant. Where do you fall on that spectrum? I'd love to hear your take on the film. With that said, let's get started talking about the background of this film. So this movie came out between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and in a lot of ways, this is kind of like the final Christopher Nolan film of an era. As soon as The Dark Knight came out, he just got skyrocketed to the top tier of fandom directors that are just beloved. Now, kind of in smaller little corners, he was already loved because Memento was such a cool film, but it wasn't like a big blockbuster that everybody saw. And a lot of people saw Batman Begins, but it wasn't a mega blockbuster. Then The Dark Knight happened and it changed everything. So this was the movie right before that. Likewise, all of his movies since The Prestige have had much bigger budgets. So this is kind of his final film before he became almost this exclusive blockbuster event director. And so in that way, this is the end of that early phase of his directorial career. This is also the first of Christopher Nolan's movies that his brother got a screenwriting credit for. Now, they've always kind of worked together. His brother's credited for coming up with the short story that Memento is based off of, though it's a little bit more complex of a story, but the original idea came from his brother. His brother did uncredited screen work on Batman Begins, but this is the one where it really became that collaboration between the two of them, so much so that he's actually credited as one of the screenwriters on it. And when you watch the special features, his brother's sitting there right there with him discussing the plot and where it kind of came from. And they originally kind of wanted to do this film a little bit earlier in their careers. Even before Batman Begins, they'd had the idea, as The Prestige is based off of a book from 1995 that had kind of caught their attention. Happens to be, if you'd like to listen to the audiobook of The Prestige for free, if you use my link down below, you can get a free trial of Audible, free 30-day trial, and a free audiobook. So if you want to listen to The Prestige for free, use that link down below. It is an affiliate link. It does help me out if you use my link, so I would appreciate it. But you can also get a free book out of it as well, and I do love Audible. So they've been interested in this book going back a long, long time. And the timing wasn't quite right. They didn't have enough time to write it, develop it, film it before doing Batman Begins, so they kind of delayed it a little bit, so that during that break between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight is when they decided to actually make the film. And one of the things that I guess Christopher Nolan found just very intriguing about it is just the way that he perceived of a lot of similarities between what magicians do and what filmmakers do. Both are in the art of dazzling audiences with things that are perceived to be real, but at the same time, everybody knows they're not real. Magicians do all these tricks that you know they're not actually conjuring sorcery to do something. Likewise with filmmakers, they're telling stories that sweep us away into these worlds, and filmmakers are trying to hide all of this, and so you just feel like you're there. And so that's a lot of what Nolan was trying to do with this film, is find all of the commonalities, and even in the structure, the film was designed around this concept of the prestige inside of the work of magicians and the art of a good magic trick that really wows an audience. He wanted to take that and apply it to movies with the way that he told this story, when he revealed information, and how he kind of had his own big ta-da at the end of the film. Oh, that's kind of, I think when you understand what Nolan was going for, makes the film more potent and more powerful. And of course, it's another film where Christopher Nolan got to work with a fantastic cast, which he's essentially done ever since then. And on that note, let's start talking about the good. And the best thing about this film for me was that it does just dive into these two magicians driven to try and be the best at what they're doing and going to extreme lengths to try and get there. There's just always something compelling about stories about people obsessed with greatness, willing to go to extraordinary lengths to get there. And in this case, it's fueled by their rivalry. They were already looking to be these showmen and seeking stardom, but they also were just obsessed with the magic itself and trying to do something that had never been done before. To kind of dive into what drives each of them, the motivators, which parts are toxic, which parts are kind of healthy with each one of them, which are their good attributes, what are their bad attributes. And of course, they're both played by these top level actors of today. This kind of adds that, I don't know, credibility to it. They're able to take characters that have a lot of bad qualities, a lot of toxic choices that they make, but because they're so charismatic and likable, you root for them more than you probably should. You're wanting things to happen because they're able to make them more relatable than they might be actually just on paper, because just how toxic these two people are. Building upon that, just as kind of one of these Christopher Nolan complex stories that uses, it kind of has, as I mentioned before, this sort of idea of Christopher Nolan's obsession with the idea of illusions and how filmmaking is very much its own form of illusions, and how that ties into these people and what magicians did back in the day to be able to pull all of this off, and how their entire lives would be absorbed in the life of being a magician, and how their whole life is a performance. Their whole life is an illusion to try and continue to go to any lengths to be able to put on a great show. And Christopher Nolan just has all of these ideas that kind of intertwine that adds to the intrigue of everything that you're watching. Of none of it's simple. None of it is what it appears on face value, much like these characters, much like the film itself, much like filmmaking itself. All of it has so many layers upon layers upon layers, adding density to that. Even the genre of the film is a little bit tricky to pinpoint, because it is this historic film. It's also a story about magician. It's a character study. There's like sci-fi elements that kind of tie in at one point in time, but you don't even know how much the sci-fi ties into it. All of it is this mesh of things that interest Christopher Nolan that can be interpreted in light of any one of these, but it's so much more than any one of the different buckets that it potentially falls into. Likewise, it's a story that only like someone like Christopher Nolan would be able to handle. It has a lot of layers on top of layers. The storytelling's taking place in multiple different timelines from two different characters' perspective. It's showing us a lot of different things to kind of disorient us. And in almost any other director's hands, it would be just kind of a total mess. But he's someone that kind of thinks that way, so he's able to structure it so you're still able to follow with the story that's kind of in a lot of different places all at once. And for me, this is a movie that got better as it went along. Some movies are just really great at the setup, and they're great with introducing us to a world, and then once you kind of get into the body of it, it loses some momentum and isn't all that satisfying of a conclusion. I had almost the opposite experience with this film of it's a little bit too disorienting at the beginning, but as you go throughout the film and you start to understand what's going on and realizing all the trickery that was happening, not just from the characters, but also from Christopher Nolan, it leads to a far more satisfying conclusion than the beginning was for me. And I think that's normally good. A movie, you want to end on a high note, not end like, okay, that just happened. And even to the concept of the film of the prestige being kind of like the final ta-da inside of a magic trick, the movie being structured around the way magic tricks are done, it really kind of does that. Is as you get to the end, it ends you at your kind of peak emotion for the film as you see how it all ties together. But from there, let's move on to the bad. So as I mentioned before, I put out a ranking of the Christopher Nolan films 3 years ago when Dunkirk came out, and I had this movie very low on my list. You know, I was always been positive on it because he's Christopher Nolan, so he doesn't have a bad movie in his filmography from my perspective, but it was very low on my list. And a lot of people, because they have it in their top tier, had a lot of questions about, like, why don't you like The Prestige? What's your problem with The Prestige? And wanted me to answer that. And so I was actually pretty excited to rewatch the film to see how much I liked it more and how much I could kind of articulate better what about the film felt kind of at arm's length and didn't fully work for me, because I think the twists and turns, the actual prestige moment of the film, all of that's good, as I just mentioned. Of course, you've got a fantastic cast giving great performances, compelling study into these two jerks, but that's the problem. Problem number one, at least, is that the two characters are just too big of jerks. And in different ways, each of them makes such bad and toxic choices that it's difficult to kind of root for them. It's difficult to really want them to succeed and fully be invested in their journey when it's driven by so much toxicity and so much destruction for the people around them that they're just burning bridges. Everyone else is facing these consequences in this rivalry and pursuit of fame and excellence, that it kind of steals some of the joy out of the film, especially with something like magic. When you think about magic, it's that awe and wonder. You're supposed to be like wowed by it and excited by it. But because of the nature of these characters being so toxic in their rivalry, this is a lot more tragedy than it is awe-inspiring. You're watching it and you get to the end, you're like, oh man, that was brutal. And there's a little bit of hope and a little bit of how it plays out. But these two guys make so many bad choices that hurt so many people and lead to such awful, awful things happening that it certainly doesn't have that wow, awe that you want from a magic trick. And there is kind of that's one of the vibes of the film, is the commonalities between magic tricks and filmmaking. And so when instead of it ending with the inspiration, it just ends with tragedy, for that reason, it kind of holds it back for me and doesn't have the right quite vibe to it. Second kind of issue I have with the film is that I think even with Nolan being someone that can stop this thing from being a total mess, all the layering of stories and timelines was a little bit too much. And I think actually it's a movie with this kind of structure and multi-layered narrative, different timelines. To do all that, I think it needed to probably be like a mini series for television, something like that. Jonathan Nolan, Christopher Nolan's brother, who was one of the main screenwriters on it. I mean, that's a lot of what he did, like with the show Westworld. It's very complex, layered storytelling, but it had 10 episodes to do it. And I think when you do it here, there's just not enough room to breathe for certain things. So you'll have a character meet someone, and then it cuts to a different scene and go to another scene, and then suddenly these two people are married 2 minutes later. And so it just kind of goes through things. You'll have one of these two guys develop a new magic trick, and the next scene is the other guy showing up to sabotage it. So you don't have, there's not room to breathe on all these different things they're trying to do. It just set up and then sabotage. Whereas if you saw some of the success with these things that they're trying to do, if you felt the relationship a little bit more, it would pay off better. But because it has so many layers, it's just, especially the first half, feels like it's almost montaging through stuff just to get us where we need to go in the story so you can really get to the conclusion of it. And so I think if this had been 8-episode miniseries where each of this, like where he meets his wife, so you care a lot more when stuff goes wrong there, I think that would make for a much more potent story. So with the limitations of the film moving so quickly, some of it was just a little bit too scattered for me and not developed enough. Like I said, still a good movie, but if you're wondering, like, why is this one not that top tier Nolan for me? I just can't root for these two characters. They're just too tragic, too toxic, and then there's too much going on for a 2-hour movie for me. Real quick before I give you my final score on this one, be sure to tell me what you thought down below in the comment section. Also remember, since I'm going through all of Christopher Nolan films, I got a whole playlist right up here of Christopher Nolan movie reviews. If you've enjoyed this one, there's something up there that you'll enjoy. In the end, I find this to be a good but not great Christopher Nolan film. There's enough ideas to keep me engaged. The performances are great. That kind of works over the fact that the characters themselves aren't very likable. In the end, a film that I think just needed a little bit more of a run time to let the story breathe a little bit more, to fully realize the potential of the story. Overall, I'd give this movie a B. On the entertainment scale, it's a 7.5. And of course, it's a Christopher Nolan film, so I would encourage you to check it out, but have restricted expectations because I don't think this is one of his classics. If you've enjoyed this review, remember I've got more of them right over there. If you want to listen to the audiobook of The Prestige for free, use that link down below in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.